and I invite Aaron and Beth and Andrew, or is it just Andrew and Aaron? Yep.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
The
Put in
clicker is working.
the fact that we're live.
We've done some further work on this issue at your request. The starting point for that is that the rateability of land is set by government, and land used principally or wholly for religious worship is non-rateable. All other land, the rating treatment is something for the councillors to decide. In response to your request for us to do some further investigation, we've sought additional legal advice and given consideration to the concerns expressed by the ratepayers. We've looked at the application of that legislation and the council's current rating policy, applied that on a consistent basis across the city, looking to be fair in the way in which we've applied it both to religious properties in different parts of the city and in relation to other ratepayers. As a result, we're proposing some additional guidelines for the application that relates to properties used for religious worship. So small parts of the property, like small offices used for religious worship, wouldn't be apportioned and will be treated as non-rateable. Other parts of the property will be rated consistently with their non-religious use across the rest of the region. All of this can be implemented within the application of administrative guidelines, and only one small change will be required to our current rating policy and the funding impact statement. Now, for the 2017-18 year, there was about $2.3 million of rates applied to properties owned by religious organisations. The non-ratables review increased that to $3.6 million for the 2018-19 year. The application of the guidelines that Aaron's going to talk you through in a minute would bring that down to about $3 million, and with further work on one of the areas probably into the 2.7 or 2.8 million change. Most of the remaining move from the 2.3 to the 2.7 or 8 is from the identification of some residential properties and businesses that weren't previously rated. And there are some other drivers of change, but there's also quite a chunk of reductions as well. Just to repeat the overall principles that are at application here, legislation provides for land that's non-rateable, and how the remaining land is rateable is a decision for councillors to make, the directions of which we would follow. So, Aaron?
So the report sets out a number of rating treatment options for the different types of uses found on religious properties. In terms of the recommendations, I've just put up on the screen the key changes that we have recommended. The council can choose not to apportion, i.e. treat as non-rateable, offices that are ancillary to the religious worship. In that context, of the 255 offices that were originally identified as part of the review, around 200 of them would fall into what we'd consider the small office category. Cafes, not operated commercially, and op shops not operating in a commercial-like manner, again, would be consistent with Council's approach to how it rates for home occupations and people who undertake businesses at home. The Council does not generally apportion or rate differently someone who has a garage and a workshop and produces wooden toys who then sells them at the local market on a Sunday. So where that operation is someone's just part-time interest, which they do, the council generally does not take that as being a business operation. However, when someone converts their garage into a hairdresser and then operates that on a fully commercial basis, then the council will. So in that sense, the council does take the scale of the commercial operation into consideration when it chooses to do apportionments. The one policy change that we have suggested up here would be for libraries. And this policy change would require consultation as part of the annual plan. Essentially, libraries in most situations are non-rateable. Thinking council libraries, universities, schools, and we think it's equally appropriate to shift that treatment for other libraries used for community purposes. We also identify an issue in the treatment of halls, and we think that this is one area in particular which needs further work. We haven't been unable to take that work in the time we've had available, but essentially I think what we're suggesting is that officers go back and have conversations again with the particular ratepayers to determine the actual use of those halls, and where there's primarily a religious purpose, treat it as non-rateable. Again, we think there's further work required with those particular ratepayers. One important point to note here is that the changes that we've recommended are mostly, and I think Andrew's touched on it, achievable within a change to administrative guidelines. When we start stepping outside what we can do on a consistent basis with apportionments, that essentially becomes a policy change which would have to be consulted on. In terms of how the proposed changes would impact on rates assessed, the top line shows the number of ratepayers by band and the amount of rates that number of ratepayers by band and the different rate category changes. Important to note here, as part of the review, a number of ratepayers did experience decreases in rates. Some parts were found to be more non-rateable than they had originally been. There were 190 properties which were identified to be fully non-rateable, and 45 that were, as I said, more non-rateable than they would have been. The second line there shows what the impact would be of the application of the proposed guidelines under the officer's recommendations. And a significant impact there is essentially the treatment of officers, the small officers, taking them out of the mix, and that just basically highlights the approach taken. In terms of the change between how council was previously rating these properties and what it would be under the revised or the review process. Initially there were 175 properties that were identified as being residential and having a residential component and rated. That was in the 17-18 year. That increased to 226 as part of the non-rateable review. We touched on officers. There's 255 officers identified, but with the application of the guidelines, that would come down to around about 50. In terms of halls, we did some research into the non-religious organisations that have community halls. There are a number of them throughout the region. They're all rated residentially. But as I reiterate, there's further work that officers need to do in the space of where a hall's used for religious purposes. In terms of childcare, there is a little over 500 of those throughout the region. The great majority of those are rated as business. There's a small number, around 6, that are essentially community organisations and where they're rated as residential. In terms of op shops, there's a number of organisations that run op shops that are non-religious, Hospice, SPCA and Red Cross, and they all pay rates for their op shops. And just finally, we're also proposing a transition mechanism to apply for this year. If you've heard from today, representatives from religious organisations about the confusion and the issues associated with how this has been communicated to them. So we're proposing that for this year, that any rates be capped at what they paid last year, decreases to apply where they would have applied, that these be applied as transition grants directly to the rate account so that there's no administrative issues there, there's no requirement to apply. Right to all the ratepayers advising the outcomes of today's decision and the impacts that would have, and there would be a requirement to issue new rates invoices. That's all I have today, so we're happy to take any questions.
Aaron, Andrew, I noticed there on your revised, if we could go back to the previous one, under your revised approach, it shows actually a pretty even split. 470 actually get a decrease and 472 get an increase under this. What is the value of the decreases vis-a-vis the value of the increases?
Look, we haven't done that analysis. That there's a net increase because essentially we've been able to identify more commercial activities, primarily the car park in the city centre that we've talked about previously, but there's a small number of other things like childcare operations and the like. A small increase in the number of residential properties identified, but it's essentially a net increase.
Yep. So what was the main reason for the 470 that got decreases? What was a common theme coming through, or a common thing we found out where there was error?
Essentially, this goes back to the reason why the review was undertaken in the first place. There was an inconsistent application of the legislation from the council and interpretation as to what that meant for the rate or parts. This review has gone through and attempted to standardise that approach so that everything is treated on the same basis. Now, of course, we're recommending a little bit more work be done in the halls place because we think there's some more work that needs to be done there.
All right, before I move to, we've got two further questions. I'll just note that we have the motions in the book have been moved by Deputy Mayor and seconded by myself, so I'll just put that on the table. So, Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. And tēnā korua, gentlemen. Look, my question is going to be around a deferral of a decision based on what we've heard from the public input, but also what you've said. So, question, if there is a deferral until further consultation in regards to what we've seen with the PowerPoint and what's in the agenda item, what effect would that have around the July 2019? If we ended up saying, or do we have enough space from now until July 2019 to have that further consultation in regards to what's been put in front of us with the PowerPoint and what's on the agenda?
Oh, look, if it's the council's wish to take further time to consider that, then yes, more than happy to undertake further work. As to where that would lead, don't rightly know, but I think there's an appetite from some of the early presenters to do further engagement with them.
Okay, Chair, so look, I'll wait until the agenda because that's where I'm particularly heading only for the consultation, and if we have sufficient time between now and the implementation date of July 2019 to have further consultation, well then that's where I'll be heading. Just to let you know, Chair.
I just plant the seed, councillors, that under clause, under D of the recommendations, perhaps if we go into the transition and deferral, that we say direct officers to work with the owners of religious properties to clarify the use of halls. Just wonder if that's just a little bit too narrow, and whether we should substitute halls and would say the use of land not needed for religious worship.
Chair, thank you for that, because I was going to raise that when we actually got to the agenda item, because during the PowerPoint, Aaron, you mentioned officers and further work in this space is required as well. So I welcome that particular change to allow us the time to talk to our churches.
Okay, well, I'll go through the next 4 or 5 people, and then
Thank you.
then I'll raise the question whether that's okay. We would amend the resolution that's been put up and moved by the Deputy Mayor and myself if it appears to be heading in that direction. So we have Councillor Casey, Cashmore, Councillor Wayne Walker and Councillor Cooper. Councillor Casey.
Yeah, my question relates to paragraph 61 of the report, which is about risk. It also relates to paragraphs 12, 13 and 20. And I want to talk about risk, and especially risk to the reputation of Auckland Council, because what this has shown to me in the fantastic presentations this morning have outlined that there is a huge potential here for damage to our reputation. And I think every councillor around this table has been called to account by the local churches. I certainly fronted in Mount Albert. And what I heard was exactly what I heard today, the pain of the process, the sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I think we need to sort it, and that's what we're scrabbling to do right now. But I heard somebody say an apology might be necessary. I think that not the apology, but when you write a report, if you read what you've written, and Andrew and Aaron, it is your report I'm reading from, you've acknowledged that the letters didn't reach the appropriate people. You've acknowledged that we were doing all sorts of things at the same time, so it never quite got there. But there's nothing in there. Ratepayers expressed concern about the size and suddenness of the change. But there's nothing in the report that kind of says sorry, that we could have done it better. And I think it's not up to us to come riding in and say we could have done this better. I think it needs to, at officer level, that needs to be acknowledged that we, you know, with in some way in the report that all is, you've said all is not well, but we haven't apologised for it. And the pain of the process has to be acknowledged. So I'm looking forward to putting this right today. It's a very big wrong. And in 20 years of being a councillor in Auckland, I have never been called to account by the churches.
Question is?
The question is, why under risk did you not say there's a potential for damage to our reputation? Got nothing. You said here, and I'll quote, paragraph 61, there are no risks with the recommendations proposed in this report. I would suggest if those proposals go through today, enormous risk. If the churches go on strike, we will no longer have an Auckland that we know and love, because there'll be no resilient communities. And I heard that at a meeting. What would happen if we went on strike?
Councillor Casey, sorry, Councillor
Casey,
Casey.
you can't even contemplate it.
Councillor Casey, you asked a question. Please, I don't think it's appropriate to be canning the officers. But you've asked a question and they're going to give a response.
Thank you for identifying that additional risk, Councillor.
Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks, Mr Chair. I think my question has actually been canvassed by Councillor Philip Hine. I was concerned about doing more work on small offices and large offices. I don't think it's about size, it's actually about whether it's commercial activity. Yeah. And also the same thing with halls. I see them, they're often used for social goodwill purposes as compared to commercial activity. And the same with the car parks and proportionment. So if we can get that work done over the next 7 or so months, then I'm okay with the recommendations.
Yeah.
What was the question?
There wasn't one.
I'm just saying Alf covered my question off.
He was,
There was no question.
Did you know that Alf? Did you know that Alf covered his question? I said yes. Yes, good question.
Thank you, Councillor.
That's all right.
okay, it's good to have some humour in this. We don't want to get too way down here. So, Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker.
Got a few questions, and the first question is around B. I've got a number of concerns there. The first one goes to officers, and the mention that Councillor Cashmore made around small. There are some churches that may have a large office, but it's proportional to the mission of the church and the size of their organisation, their congregation, and the like. So, is there some other phrase there that you think might be more relevant than small?
All.
The how you'd like to treat the officers is a decision that you could make within the current law and our current rating policies. Then small is what is the appropriate definition to use. If you wished to make larger officers or to look at the nature of their activity in the way that Councillor Cashmore suggested, then other language would have to be applied. So it would have to be something like to support the religious organisation's non-commercial activities, for example, might be a way to encompass what Councillor Cashmore had suggested and what you may be wishing to suggest as well.
And the other question I've got that also goes to the matter that the church has raised around the need to deal with principles first. And we heard a lot of commentary around religious purposes as it goes to the mission of the churches, and the way conceivably that there may have been some difference in interpretation over time now compared to perhaps 100 years ago or the like. In a situation where we need to have good faith, there are issues of principle here that go to religious, small, and there may be other matters. Do you think it's more appropriate for us to go back to base one in terms of consultation, rather than trying to do something on the hop now, which is my concern? And that goes to the comment that I think other councillors have made, that we've conducted ourselves very badly, and certainly for my part I apologise.
You almost had a
for that.
question there, Councillor Walker. Question.
So, I've got a question around some specific words, a question that those words go to principles, and therefore a question, should we not go back to first base in terms of engaging in good faith with the churches to get this right?
That's what we're saying.
Right.
I think that's the choice as to how you'd like to, which options or approach you'd like to take to rating and how you'd like to move towards that decision as a decision for the councillors to make.
I should clarify just certainly for the officers who don't have to respond, but we're not doing this on the hop. We're looking at a transition for a year to look into all sorts of things, so this is not done on the hop, and we're putting the resolutions up, and we'll just flick up to D just so that we are quite clear what D would now mean. We're taking out the use of halls, and we're just taking out halls, and it's just going to put in the words land not needed for religious worship.
When are you going to put the amendment?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, wait a minute. I'm just because this actually, I'm just putting this up to signal that the mover and seconder have made that change, but actually goes some way to clarify officers. It means there's a wider view, purview of it, rather than just narrowly to halls. Now, I'm aware there is an amendment coming up later, but at the moment it hasn't been given to us or signalled to be done.
It has.
Okay, right.
In writing, it does.
I'm getting advice from, I know it's here, but
Questions for
Councillor Cooper.
the end of
questions?
My questions were, thank you for the report. I just want to get some real clarity, because one was a question around, for example, Hospice Shop, St John's, if they've got an op shop, that's fundraising activity, they pay rates?
Correct.
And that would be exactly the same, I'm just picking an example out of the year, like Salvation Army Shop or St Vincent de Paul. Currently, do they not pay rates, or are we suggesting now they do, because it's the same activity as these other non-religious organisations raising money?
So the recommendations put up by officers were to say that where the activity is not run in a commercial-like manner, because some of the op shops are only open
Yes, I see
3
that.
or 8 hours
But if they were
a week.
open the same as,
But if
say,
they're open the same,
a hospice shop or
yeah,
any of
then
those?
to treat them the same as the
Okay. All right, so is that new now, as opposed to, or has it always been treated the same?
It has always been treated the same from a policy sense, but from an application of the policy, that's what the purpose of the review was set out to
So
do.
you're saying that because there was an exemption for religious purposes, those op shops were exempt?
No, what we're,
That's what I'm trying to...
so what we're saying is that prior to undertaking the review, some op shops would not have been rated simply because the council did not have records of them.
Right. Now we do. Okay, now, so the other...
But some
yeah.
were.
Okay, that's fine. So there was an inconsistency. Some religious op shops are paying and some weren't. So now we're just evening that out or getting some fairness in that one. And the other question was, so we understand sometimes a church on its land will build a childcare and a community group will run it, or members of the church, or, you know, will provide, but basically providing a community service. So that's not rateable, and that continues to be the same.
In terms of
Is
providing...
not-for-profit childcare provided under the Education Act is non-rateable?
Yes, so if it's under the Education Act,
Yep.
then definitely it is non-rateable.
Okay, but
However,
for,
some childcare don't run under the Education Act.
that's right.
And
So,
if it's run by a community organisation for the benefit of the community, then the council's approach is to treat those as residential rather than business.
okay, but the different one is, for example, if a church takes advantage of, say, having some spare land, builds a childcare, leases it out to a private provider on their land, getting, I don't know, I know that they can fetch up to 130, 140,000 a year for a lease,
Commercial.
commercial lease, that's rateable as business.
Correct.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Simpson.
I've got a question to the staff. You've seen the amendments that I have put forward. Is there anything in those amendments that doesn't meet the requirements of either the...
Councillor, we just have to wait until we put the actual amendments up,
Can you
and
put
then
it
you
up?
can ask
I'll
that
put it
question.
up then, thank you.
And I'll second that.
Okay. Well, I thought it would be sensible just to go through the questions first, then we would put up your amendment.
Your amendments, so
relating to the amendment.
been put now,
Well,
so just pop it up.
the way I'm going to do it is we're going to just have questions, and I've got Mayor Goff, Councillor Hills, Councillor Stewart, and then I'm coming back to Councillor Simpson if there's no one else, and then we will
I'll put
discuss
my
the
hand
amendments. So, Mayor Goff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chairman. One of my questions, I think, was going to be about Councillor Simpson's amendment, so let me put that one first. I understand that that amendment is that...
No, can we, no,
Well,
let's be quite...
There's
if you
ruling.
Sorry, point of order, Mr Chair. The difficulty is that once we get to making comments, then under standing orders, we should not ask questions of officers.
Yeah.
I need to ask questions of officers in order to understand what the implications of the amendment could be. So would it not be helpful if we could do it in that way? Otherwise, we're going to have to bring officers back to the table to ask questions, and it's a little untidy.
We're going to put up the amendments now. Okay?
Thank you. So let me ask the question: what has been the practice in the past in terms of rating properties used as residence by officiating ministers? Have they normally been rateable or not rateable, or have some been and some not been? Can you elucidate on that?
So the policy previously was that they would be rated as residential.
So when you say policy previously, you mean before this
Well,
exercise?
and the policy now, until you decision, depending on your decisions from today onwards, of course,
What has been the policy historically?
that they will be rated residential.
Yeah.
The policy hasn't been applied consistently across the region. There are 175 residential properties on religious property that were rated previously. We've now identified some more, and there's 226 properties. The previous, for up to 2017-18, we were collecting about $650,000 in rates from these residential properties. That would increase to $750,000 for the 19-20 year. It's about $2,000 a property, or around the average for the region.
Okay. Can I ask, secondly, what's the principle? I mean, I agree if it's anomalous, some are rated, some aren't. you've got to remove the anomaly. But what is the principle that you are following in terms of determining the rateability of such properties? And how is, I mean, maybe you can elucidate on how that's dealt with nationwide, because there must be practice in other cities.
So in terms of the principle, it's the application of the legislation. So the legislation says where it's used solely or primarily principally for religious worship. And we would argue that a residence in manse would not be solely for religious worship, it would be principally for the residence. So in which case the activity is a residence, in which case it would be rateable. Then it's up to how that would be treated under the individual council's rating policy for residences. In our case, a residence is rated as residential. And other councils, they may have different treatment depending on different circumstances.
Okay, but obviously the dollar sums, it's not about dollars, because you're only talking about $100,000 difference. Yeah. Okay. Can I just? I'm still puzzling over the question first raised by Deputy Mayor Cashmore. Why is the size of the office, rather than the purpose for which the office used, a relevant factor?
So this comes back to when the council chooses to create an apportionment for the activity and the use that is associated with it. And that principally comes down to how big the office is. So if the office is small, then it's not so large as to detract from the principal use. When the office gets larger, then it is principally an office rather than some other use. So there's one particular example where there is 97% of the property is an office and a very small part is for religious worship. So there has to be a distinction somewhere along the lines for consistency with how apportionments are done for other properties.
Okay.
So there are 255 offices, and 200 of those are definitely small ones and will be non-rateable under the guidelines that have been suggested.
Okay. So we're talking about 50 offices, but if those offices are used solely for the purpose of administering the church, wouldn't that come within the category of being used for religious purposes?
It would be used for religious purposes, but it wouldn't be for religious worship.
Okay. So that's a
a
difficult one to work through. I'm not sure what the answer is. My final question, Mr. Chair, thank you for your indulgence. With the amendment we've put up under D, I think if you recall the conversation we were having with the churches when they were at the table, it would help this process if actually the principles are all agreed under 4. I think that's a huge step forward. How do you apply those principles? And that's where consultation with the churches would be useful. Would you be happy if the amendment were to read something, direct officers to work with owners of religious properties to clarify the use of premises deemed not to be used for religious purposes? That would, Mr. Chair, maybe I should be directing that to you. That would then encompass the range of issues and give the churches the chance to come back and have dialogue with you about whether your interpretation and their interpretation match.
That would...
Okay, no, that was coming back to the chair. So what we've got here, we've actually, because it was asked of me to put the amendment up, so we're actually not talking about D, because the amendment put up by Councillors Simpson and Newman actually excludes D, which means there'll be no more consultation with the churches, which I can't quite understand the logic of that. So we're actually talking about the amendment at the moment, and the amendment has excluded D. So let's be quite clear.
Well,
whereas the Deputy Mayor and myself were actually trying to broaden D to beyond halls so that there would be further consultation on non-religious, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just going to get Matthew to say something as well.
Sure, that's not what they intend.
So through the chair, Aaron, Andrew, just question, because I think it might be valuable, just in relation to today's decision on the policy, but I think councillors need to get a sense of the coming months and the annual plan and how this actually plays out. So I just want to make sure everyone's very clear on, if you are to make a decision today, what you're deciding on and what that does or doesn't allow subsequently in terms of further engagement with churches in the setting of next year's rates. So I just think it would be helpful to get that very clear so that we're doing what we intend.
And Andrew, I'll just have a supplementary to that. I want you to explain by taking D out also what that means. And I know there's a D there, let's not get confused. The D up in front of you is the E that's in your paper. The D in the paper, which is about further consultation, has been removed under this amendment. So could you comment on both, Andrew, please?
So, first of all, in regard to the D in the paper, either as it stands or amended, we would do that anyway, whether we were directed to or not.
Yep.
So the recommendations in the officers' report, look, you're talking large or big offices, that's pretty clear for the bulk of the office space. But there'll be some that fall between those guidelines where we would want to talk with the property owners whether we were directed to or not to assist us in making that judgment. Similarly with the halls, there was an example that's come through recently of a hall in Epsom that was used extensively for Sunday school, so their rating's been adjusted to non-rateable, and we'd want to have that conversation with the property owners in regards to the recommendations that officers have put forward. So we would do that with or without the resolution of the councillors. I think it's helpful though if you're asking us directly to do that, and it sends a positive message in terms of the organisation's reputation. In regard to what would happen decision-making wise, if the council accepted the guidelines proposed by the officers, there'd be one small consultation item in the annual plan. However, officers would do the work I've just referred to with the churches to get the right, to ensure we had all the information to exercise the right judgment on the use of those parts of the properties, particularly the offices, the op shops, etc. If the council went with the alternative recommendations, because we couldn't implement many of those administratively, we would have to consult on some new rating differentials as part of the annual plan, and you would be able to then consult on that, and decisions will be made and implemented through the annual plan process.
Okay.
Point of order. Sorry, Chair, I hate calling point of order.
Yeah, I hate them too.
And the reason I'm calling it, Chair, is that now that you have put the amendment on the table, that is what we need to discuss.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we're going from amendment to the original substantive, which is no longer on the table.
Correct.
Back to the amendment. So, Chair, can I suggest, and the point of order is that we continue with the amendment and to see, because I've got questions on the amendment for our officers.
Thank you. I take your point of order, and I
yeah,
agree. I tried pretty hard to stick
Yeah,
to the amendment.
I know that, Chair.
Tried to stick with one at a
Yeah.
time, and got advised by generally the mood around the table was no, we blend them.
Yeah.
We are going back to the amendment, please. Councillor Simpson, you're next. You speak.
Question?
Yep, no, speak
I've
to your amendment if you wish to, or question. Well, you obviously don't have any questions on your amendment. So, Councillor Hills.
Well, point of order for clarification. I'm pretty sure that in standing orders we can still ask questions based on the report, despite an amendment being on the table.
I'm happy with that too, Councillor Hills.
Well, sorry,
Yep, so Councillor Hills,
I've got
question.
standing orders in front of me.
That's right.
I'm letting Council. We'll get nowhere if we keep point of ordering, put it that way. So I'm just allowing Councillor Hills to ask a question, and also it will relate to the amendment as well. as
I'm
the
happy
original
to move to
substantive.
suspend standing orders.
Councillor Hills.
If it helps the discussion.
I'll second that.
Anyway, for orderly meetings, we need the standing order. So Councillor Hills.
Thank you,
Councillor
Chair.
Hills.
Thank you, Chair. When I asked questions when Councillor Simpson brought this to us a few months ago, or brought it up, that we were largely told it was because staff were administering the actual law and we're just running through a process. That's why, is that why there wasn't more significant consultation at the beginning?
Yes.
And my concern, so whatever happens, we have already decreased rate payments this year for those 470 and the 45 that are now no longer included.
Yes.
So we're really talking about consulting with the 470 that go up. So regardless of what we do, the 470 legally have already had their rates reduced due to us using the law the way we should have probably been doing anyway.
Yes.
So how does that sit us? So my views on, I have a lot of views and concerns about the process and where we've come to and fairness, but my concern is that we are applying the rules because we legally have to for the 470 that go down. How can we possibly not apply the rules for the 470 that are going up?
In regard to this year, the recommendation that we've made is that you may wish to consider having a transition because of the time it's taken to arrive at the decision and the uncertainty, and because of the issues we've identified with how effective our communication was.
Oh, no,
That's the,
yeah.
but it would be for a year,
Yeah.
and then the guidelines would apply.
I totally support that premise because I think that's fair and that's good. My concern is, what if we do not support what you've identified are legal rulings basically, and we've applied that to the 470 that go down, and then we change the rules, even though we're having this transition, which I think is great and important to continue the conversation. But what effect will that have on the 470 if we've changed 470 that have had their rates reduced already or dropped off, if we change the rules for the... Because we're really consulting with the people whose rates are going up. I'm sure the people whose rates have gone down or disappeared aren't going to be complaining.
So any consultation that we undertake would provide the opportunity for any ratepayer, whether they're an owner of a religious property or otherwise, to engage, to provide their feedback to the council. If we were just looking to administer the rules, as suggested in the council's resolution D, then we would be working with the ones who are going to be affected to ensure that we had all the information to exercise the appropriate judgment on their rating treatment. So this one's more of an engagement in working with people, the other is a consultation required to implement policy changes. There's a couple of different dimensions there.
Okay. That's all the questions. Thank you.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Just, it's really good we've actually got a collective of the churches here. One of my concerns is I think there are churches out there that have been incorrectly rated previously, and can they now be rectified? Because some of those that I think have been rated incorrectly, probably even 5-10 years ago, can now, with the support they're going to have from the other churches and for the council, for us to, under D, direct officers to communicate these decisions with those affected ratepayers, can we rectify anything that has been done wrong in the past?
Yeah, so if we've been charging someone more rates than we should have been, then we're able to we go back somewhere between we go back 5 years and correct their rates accordingly for that period. Only if they're going to go down, don't make corrections to increase rates outside of the current rating year. So for those properties who've been overrated, we go out and establish that, we'll make the adjustments.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, my question has actually been asked, but I think I would like to ask Aaron and Andrew, because they're senior policy officers, was there internal discussion amongst officers around the need for consultation? Because you've been around for a while, you'll know that some issues become triggers more so than others. Was there discussion, and is there anything we can take from this in terms of best practice going forward?
So in terms of this, this from the outset was not seeking to change council's policy, and as such, my understanding of the legislation is that the term consultation in a legislative sense is different in terms of what we would call engagement. So from a legal perspective, the council was not changing its policy per se, and therefore the legislative guidelines for consultation weren't triggered. However, that doesn't preclude the council from engaging with the affected ratepayers, and that's what has been attempted to be done. But obviously, you've heard today that has been done unsatisfactorily.
I mean, this is such a difficult one because you get into this whole religious purposes vis-a-vis religious worship, and that is a very sorry, it's making a bit of a noise. Anyway, no, my question was answered earlier, but thank you for that, and because I do think there are some lessons that we can actually take out of this process.
Thank you, Councillor Newman.
Thank you. It's been interesting. With respect to the officers' recommendations, which are carried over in the amendment to land use, retail, commercial or industrial, which you regarded as the rating approach should be business, would commercial include office?
So the council's current rating policy is that land used for offices falls within the business rating differential.
Yep.
Now, at where it's not an ancillary part of the property, so that, as I said, there's about 55 of the offices aren't definitely small. Obviously, we want to, if we were to be applying our recommendations, then we would probably want to have a careful look at those to ensure that there weren't any in a grey area that were more appropriately treated as ancillary.
Yep. So,
just as a complete aside, without having discussed this with Aaron, another way to look, I mean, these are treated business for the other community organisations in the city as well.
yep. So, I mean, the amendment seeks to address the issue of the church office, but with respect to land use, retail, commercial or industrial, I'm essentially just wanting to know, does that include office or not? I think it does, and therefore the other category of office relates to the church office. Is that I got that right?
Sorry, I was suggesting another option to Aaron that you might want to hear, so I missed part of that. I mean, I'm just noticing that we didn't include this in our report. The childcare, for example, the ones that don't meet the Education Act but are community are rated as residential. Another option to consider might be as to whether some of the offices are treated that are large offices for the organisation could be non-rateable, as the alternative recommendation suggests, or the larger ones could be treated as residential in line with how the non-commercial childcare is treated. Just sorry, that was an aside.
Just wrapping it up. So offices offices do fall in the retail, commercial, or industrial land use category for business rating purposes in this line.
So, looking across the ratepayer base, an office is associated generally with commercial activity.
Thank you.
However, not all offices are supporting a commercial activity,
yep.
And there are a number of religious and non-religious organisations that are not-for-profits, for example, which have offices which they all fall into the business category.
Thank you. Desley picked that up.
Councillor Philippine.
Thank you, Chair. Speaking only to the amendment, I've got questions to the officers, and just to sort of make clarification around, Councillor Newman referred to the table that was in the agenda, which is no longer, and he referred to what we've got in our amendment as copied across, but I know it hasn't. So if we have a look at those that have been amended from the original agenda item, Can you tell me whether there's any repercussions that we as council will have? And also, when you have a look at down them, what differences there will be in regards to monies received? So, for example, in the car parks, that particular one's been changed. And how much of a difference will that make compared to the original motion? There's also one about the halls. That's been, and I've got questions to that. So if we go through that particular table, what are the repercussions in regards to having these decisions made and the amendment goes through? I think it's important that we end up finding what financial repercussions there are.
And we'll start
look, at a
start
very...
at the top, Andrew, yep.
Well, look, at a very rough overall level, it would bring the rates take from down by... So it's 2.3 at the moment. It was going to be 3.6. It's probably, with our guidelines, be about 2.8. If we applied the approach here, it would be down to about 1. So there's about $1.7, $1.8 million. How that's broken up, there's about 750,000 in the residential category. The halls is about 2. Car parks is not a lot.
Apart from the big one.
Apart from that one large one
Yeah.
of 240,000, which would still pay. The halls and gymnasiums, 290,000, but I think under officers' recommendations that would probably be coming down quite substantially as well, so that's not too affected. Cafes, I think they're the same under both recommendations. The childcare, comparing the two, I think that's the same. Op shops, there's only small amounts involved, so it's not really material. It's in the office space, probably 100,000 or so potentially in that space, Aaron? Ballpark?
It could be quite a bit. Yeah.
1.8 still money, Desley. That's the point I'm making. So, but that's why I wanted to ask the question. So then all of us hears it.
Oh no, sorry. The officers, that's not 100, is it? It's quite a bigger figure, Aaron.
I mean, at the end of the day, officers on site which exist for the religious purposes, I think you could probably argue that any organisation office is used for religious purpose. And in that sense, it would be, you'd have an inconsistency between the religious organisation and the non-religious organisation there. In terms of those amendments, some of them are policy changes, so they would require explicit consultation rather than changes to administrative guidelines.
Okay, can we just...
So the key changes will be residential about 750,000, offices, the larger offices are possibly in that similar scale, I think, if I look. Because we haven't counted it in that way, so it's off the cuff. If there's 175 there, and going to the first page, there's a million there. What it is, correct? Yeah, so there's about, So the two big numbers are the offices and the residential.
Okay,
and they make up most of the difference.
So at the moment, we haven't done our full, complete work on the repercussions that there could be. Is that a fair sort of statement, question to you?
We can give the broad orders of magnitude, but we haven't added them up to the exact dollars.
Okay, if we go back and, sorry, Sandra, can we go to the halls, please? In regards to the amended, and with the amendment, with halls, if the halls, and I'm not saying that it'll happen, but if the halls are hired out for commercial, is that saying that really they're just saying all the halls, if it's used for religious purposes, treated as non-rateable, so if they end up hiring it out, it's really them telling us this is what we've done. I just think that work hasn't been done on that as well.
If a hall's used for 2 or 3 or 4 Sunday school classes and then rented out a couple of times to a community group, and then it's does a wedding on a Saturday, it'll probably still be classified as primarily used for religious purposes and non-rateable.
Cool, okay, and if we go back up, sorry Sandra, I want to have a look at, sorry, down the bottom to D. So with D,
Sorry, Councillor Filipaina, that D there is the E in the report. The
yeah,
D's-
yeah, no,
the D's gone, okay?
and the D, yeah, so look, I'm looking at the D from the amendment. So this is the D for the amendment, I'm assuming. Tesley?
Yep.
Sorry, councillor.
Yep.
So look, with question on D, and Aaron, you mentioned that as a result, if these go through, we will have to go out for consultation. And you know, you've said that, and so is that correct?
So in terms of if the amendments went through, then we'd have to amend C to reflect the bits that needed to be consulted on.
Okay. And with D, all I see in that is that if this amendment goes through, we basically go back to our churches who have presented and said, look, these are the changes we have made, and we leave it at that. Is that correct in what D's saying? Is that we go communicate the decisions to effect and saying, look, this is what we've decided, and that's it?
D essentially is something we'd probably do anyway, is that we would, because we've been in communication with these ratepayers about this issue, and we've communicated to them that the decision was going to be made today. If the council decided to do something other than, you know, decide whatever it wanted to do, there's still an issue of communicating that back to the affected ratepayers, and whatever happened going forward, they would need to know what's it meant to them. So we'd have to do that in any sense.
Okay. I reserve my right to speak in regards to the amendment.
Now, Councillor Simpson, I believe you have a question.
I have a question, so I'm not speaking, I'm a question. So, is there anything in the amendments that aren't within our powers to do today?
The amendments, you can decide on all the amendments, but you'll be deciding to consult on making some of those changes.
My second question is, what are you suggesting we add to C should the amendment go through for the consultation?
So in that sense, you like for officers, essentially at the moment, where there's some discretion in where it's an ancillary office, but when it becomes larger than ancillary, then that becomes a policy change rather than a application of guidelines. In terms of childcare operations,
it's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same. So essentially anything where we're stepping away from something we can accommodate within the bounds of administrative practicality, it then comes into the bounds of policy change, which then requires a
So are you happy that C stays as it is, and then you would feed back to us before we hit the annual budget?
Well,
C was an attempt to get it over and done with now, so that you didn't have to have another consideration of to agree again later on. But we can come back to, if you needed that, we could certainly come back to you.
So we could bring back the areas for consultation, building on the decision today, and specifically identify them when we report for the materials to be included in the annual plan. So if you wanted to, if you agree to some of the proposals in the amendment, then we would direct officers to report back on the matters required for consultation for the annual plan, and then we'd encompass it in that reporting.
Happy to do that. Okay. Thank you. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Right. I have a question. So just regards halls, how many community, that is ratepayer-owned halls, would we have in the city who do pay rates, and that's distinct from council halls? How many community-owned halls would be paying rates, and if this amendment went through, because it's relevant, you're seeing how many others?
So
120.
There are 124 halls owned by non-religious organisations, which are rated as residential because they are owned by community organisations for the benefit of the community. Their total rates is around 630,000. And yeah, so they raised residential along with the in accordance with the current policy.
Councillor Hills.
My other question, so are we saying on the residential, if this amendment went ahead, we would be removing 175 residences that are currently being rated and always have been?
I don't think we'd have enough information. We'd have to go back to the ratepayers themselves to work out which particular properties were captured by this to get that information. But what we'd say is definitely some would come out, and yes.
So, and when does the Councillor Simpson talks about $1 million? A lot of that has already been paying. A lot of those people, organisations have already been paying rates. It's not like we're magically just starting to pay rates. We're actually removing people.
Great.
Right, now, I have Councillor Cooper, but, you know, I've been asking the same thing. Is it sensible at this time we try to, because we've got two lists here, or two charts, that we actually get the mover to go through and succinctly explain the changes? Is that, Councillor Cooper, would you like to?
Well, just a question.
Yep,
It's just
you go
around,
first. Go first.
I'm not comfortable with voting for something. It's almost like voting for something and then retrospectively going and changing your policy, and that's what I'm a bit concerned about. I'm not intrinsically opposed, but I just worry that we've got the process back to front. And so I'm not quite sure, because it's really hard to see everything. You can't see it all in front of you, what's in your total recommendation, because we're sort of saying let's...
Very hard.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to understand, you know, because often you end up voting for these and you don't understand the full implications because you can't see it. So there's stuff around, and I have to go back to A because I want to know whether this is still stands, deferring the increases. So does that mean whatever we said we were going to do, and we already had it in the budget, because given we set a budget on what we need to spend, it's not just a sloshy pot of money. If we don't get this money now, that means if we're saying transition, right? Oh, now we can see that. So we're going to transition it, but then we're going to look at all of this table for next thing. Yeah. So when we're saying affected people in your amendment, then does that mean no one's affected if we're not doing it this year? And then we're going back and saying, well, if you've paid some of this, we're going to pay you back, or whatever. So that's what I'm trying to understand, to understand the implications of your amendment. Because if we literally are voting on policy changes without consultation, we basically then would be voting on a draft policy change. So that's what's so confusing here.
Just to clarify, you wouldn't be voting on the policy change now. What you'd be doing is signalling that you'd want to consult on these policy changes as part of the annual plan.
Okay, so the question then is, what's the stuff about effective parties then if we're going to vote on having a transition where we don't do it this year?
Yeah.
Because the reality is, if you're going to consult, you cannot just consult with the affected parties, because as we've heard, this means that if this is not paid by one group, it will fall on another to pick it up, and that is the rest of the ratepayers, all of the ratepayers. So for me, it's about, if we're going to consult, we have to consult with everybody in an annual plan process. And as we've heard from the gentleman from the Rationalist Society, about 50% of people don't identify with a religious affiliation, and so we need to be fair across the board to all ratepayers, all members of the public, who will then carry the burden of the money we don't receive. So that's what I'm trying to understand about the new D. Who will be the affected ratepayers if we vote for A that says we're not doing this year? Or is it just going back to the people that say, oh, well, you had that rates demand, now it will be changed? That's what I'm trying to understand, because it's sort of a bit contradictory.
That's a very good question, that Councillor.
Yeah, so we can't, if we are proposing to make policy changes, then we are obliged to consult with everybody, irrespective of what the resolution says. The law requires us to consult with everyone.
Thank you. But
so D in itself is to address that these particular ratepayers have been told that you know, the council is considering the issue, and that a decision, whatever it is, would be made today.
To go back to them and tell them what
and
our
what the outcome of the
decision
decision
is
is. Yep.
Thank you.
Right, what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute break because everyone's getting very busy. And then we're going to come back and Councillor Simpson is then going to quickly and succinctly roll through her amendments in the chart and the differences there. So we're quite clear. And Andrew and Aaron, if you could at the same time quickly at the end of say whether it's discussing residential, the cost of that, this figure, and then Councillor Simpson will then move on to the next one. So we're having a 5-minute break. Thank you.